I'm Stephen Foskett, the organizer of Tech Field Day, and you're about to see a presentation and discussion with Docker. Around the table we have a dozen and more independent experts in enterprise IT, and they are here to listen, to discuss, and to interact during the presentation. If you'd like to learn more about this event, you can go to techfieldday.com, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, you can go to youtube.com/techfieldday.
My name is Michael Friis. I'm a product manager at Docker. So I work on a few different things. One of them is all of the stuff that Docker does with Microsoft. And what I'll cover today specifically is Windows containers, which Vivek brought up earlier. But aside from just Windows containers, we do all sorts of other stuff with Microsoft. Microsoft's been really good about publishing and maintaining .NET base images, for example, on Docker Hub for both Windows and Linux, really. And SQL Server team, the Microsoft SQL Server team, also publishing Docker base images with SQL Server pre-installed. And if you followed the news today, they went public with SQL Server on Linux. And one of the ways that they let you try out SQL Server on Linux is actually with a Docker container that's available from Docker Hub. We also work with the Visual Studio guys and with Azure to make Docker a great experience on Microsoft Azure. All right, with that, let's talk some more about Docker on Windows Server 2016. So this came about from out of a partnership that Docker and Microsoft formed 2 years ago in 2014. And the idea was that Microsoft was going to go implement containerization primitives in the Windows kernel. And then Docker and Microsoft would collaborate on porting the Darken Engine and all the related tooling to Windows. And that kind of came to fruition a couple of months ago. In October, Microsoft launched Windows Server 2016, where the kernel had containerization primitives, and Darken Engine runs on top of Windows Server. So you can now start and stop and manage containerized processes, native Windows containerized processes, same as you can on Linux. And I'll demo this in a bit. And then on the side, we worked on making sure that you can push Windows container images to Docker Hub, and that all the other Docker tooling works well with Windows containers.
Who's asking for this? My mind's kind of going, wait a minute. This, why are we doing this? Who wants Docker on Windows?
I mean, so I think from our standpoint, right? This from Docker's standpoint, it increases our addressable market, right? This Windows workloads is still half, if not more, of all kind of enterprise IT. So if you go into a legacy, like a big corporation, then often half of their stuff, if not more, is running on Windows systems.
It's really just going after that enterprise space as opposed to hyperscale, web scale people that have traditionally been container users.
Yeah, I don't know. So I don't have anything against Windows. I think it's it's an okay operating system, and you can actually now you can do modern stuff with Windows using Docker. Also hyperscale stuff. So as part of the 2016 launch, they also announced a new variant of Windows called nanoserver, which is this kind of minimalist version of Windows that's only a couple hundred megabytes, and it's pretty neat. You can do good stuff with it. But yeah, I think the main target is helping big enterprises lift and shift legacy apps into containers to make them more manageable and easier to move around.
No, I've heard through the grapevine, I don't know if this is true or not, that not only is Docker available on Windows Server 2016, but it's built in from the get-go.
Yeah, I'll cover that in a little bit. Yeah, so basically, you actually have to run 2 PowerShell commands to enable it, and then it's there. But Microsoft supports it, and you can pick up the phone and call Microsoft and say, hey, I have a problem running Docker on Windows, and they'll help you.
So it's shipping with it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ethan, I think to your point that there's not necessarily a demand for it right now, but Microsoft wants it to be available so that there could be a demand for it later on, right?
I have to understand what the problems are being solved with this that aren't being solved in the virtual machine world already. That's the thing I'm not getting.
Well, I'll demo that in a little bit, but same as on Linux, managing containers on Windows is just way nicer than shuffling VMs around. Like they're smaller, they boot faster, you can get way better density, and it's a much better.
The same advantages you get on the Linux side. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'll show that.
But ultimately, one of the examples that they're driving to is like Internet Explorer 7 in a container, because you've got that one legacy app.
Yeah, so actually,
really kind of where they're going? Or
well, so actually, no, it's not really. GUI apps are actually not supported, but it is like full framework .NET apps. You can port those. People working on making SharePoint work. SQL Server runs great in containers. Any kind of server-side Windows app that doesn't require GUI will run great in a Windows Docker container. Yeah, I mean, I think we see demand, like when we go out and present Docker Data Center and Docker in general to big enterprise customers, they ask, hey, can we use this to manage our Windows workloads?
Yeah, one of the biggest advantages I've seen when I talk to people and what they're excited about on the Windows side is continuous integration. Just building a CI pipeline is something that Docker and containers make way easier. Oh.
Is it on?
Let me try that again. One of the advantages we've seen when we're talking with Windows folks that they're excited about is the ability to do continuous integration. So building a CI pipeline that allows you to take a series of code commits and automatically create images out of that, push that into a development or staging server. So that's something that works just as great on or the ideal is to make it work just as great on Windows as it does on Linux. There's a series of value props that we've seen. It's typically the similar value props to the Linux world, but they are things that would make the DevOps process much easier in a Windows environment.
I think the other thing, real quick, when I get this question from people, I just give you a scenario. So you walk into the office on Monday and your boss says, hey, I got a project for you this weekend. Turn the mic on. The mic is on. If by on you mean slide it up into the position where it says ON. Might be dead.
Dark as a service.
Anyway, what I was saying, so you walk in and your boss says, hey, take those 1,000 VMs running Windows and move those from vSphere up into AWS. Like, that's a really hard problem. If those workloads are in containers, that problem becomes more trivial. And it's the exact same benefit you get in the Linux world, as Michael's been saying, but it's that portability. And what we're seeing with a lot of people, and I think we'll talk about this more, is that it's really, with Windows, a lot of it today is a lift and shift scenario. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so Vivek already covered this, but Docker kind of provides a full build, ship, run workflow that lets you easily ship software. So this slide is just showing that we're trying to build the same thing with Microsoft technology, including Windows, Visual Studio, all the rest of it. So I'll demo this, but for some of the kind of technical details for Windows Server, the base images work a little bit different than on Linux. So you know how if you use Docker on Linux, you can kind of start from scratch, which is an empty file system. Or you can start from Debian or Alpine or Ubuntu or some other base image. When you're building Windows containers, you can start from one of two base images. One is Windows Server Core, which kind of represents pretty much a full Windows userland. So it's a little bit large, but it also means that you can run any kind of legacy app, including IIS, SQL Server, or the full .NET framework. The other option that you have is nanoserver, which I mentioned before, which is a new kind of minimal version of Windows. The good thing about that is that the base layer is way smaller, so fewer updates, all the rest of it. But it's not kind of complete Windows userland, so you're a little bit limited in the kind of Windows apps that you can run in there. But Microsoft has ported IIS and the .NET Core .NET version also works in nanoserver. So yeah, those two you get to choose between those two base layers. And then there's of course base layers built by other people on top of those two. So Microsoft also maintains Docker images that has IIS or .NET or SQL Server pre-installed that you can just grab from Docker Hub. So the other choice that you have is a choice of isolation. So when Darken Engine got ported to Windows, Microsoft added two different kind of drivers for running containers on Windows. One is called Windows Server Containers, which is a model similar to on Linux. So it's a shared kernel model. So all the containers running on a particular host share the same kernel, and they also share that with other userland processes on that system. So with that, you get the same benefits as on Linux, like very good density, very fast startup times, because the containers are just really normal userland processes that run in an isolated context with a sandboxed file system and Windows registry. The other option is Hyper-V containers. So the way Hyper-V containers work is actually every time you start up a new container, it runs in its own hypervisor with its own kernel, with a very minimal kernel. So that boots up, then the container image is placed inside of that hypervisor, and then the container processes start. So with that, startup is a little bit slower, and you don't get quite as good density, but you get perhaps slightly better isolation, because if a container process is compromised, the attacker has to escape out through the hypervisor before they can compromise the host system. So the neat thing about this is that the images are exactly the same. So you can take a Docker Windows image that you created with Windows Server containers, and you can just deploy it as a Hyper-V with Hyper-V isolation if you want, and vice versa. So they're completely interchangeable, and it's just kind of a deployment option that you have at runtime to do one or the other. Same as with kind of seccomp profiles or other ways that you might lock down containers running on Windows.
Sorry, just to check, in that instance, if you're spinning up as Hyper-V ones, is every individual container getting its own Hyper-V one, or are you then running multiple containers on top of an individual
They
Hyper-V
each get
instance?
their own.
Each gets their own?
Yeah.
Right.
And then Microsoft's done there's a great talk from the last DockerCon actually with John Starks, one of the engineers from Microsoft, where he goes into the details of this. They use some of the neat Hyper-V features where they, basically the first one you boot up typically takes a few seconds, but then they freeze that, like they freeze the state right before they put in the container image. So the second one you boot up, they can just reuse that kind of memory snapshot. So the second boot is way faster.
Very similar to the way VMware does it under Photon, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar, but yeah, it's Hyper-V technology that's been around for a while.
You mentioned no GUI apps. Is that coming, or is there a technical reason we're never going to be able to do that?
So it actually worked in earlier tech previews of Windows Server 2016. So for Windows Server Core, I don't think there's a technical reason it doesn't work. I think Microsoft decided it was simpler to communicate, that it was just for server-side apps. Also, kind of the user management of the in-container processes is a little bit. It's not like how you'd normally think of a full VM. So that get a bit funky, I think. But there's no kind of crazy technical limitation that means that you can't do it. And I think you can actually, if you insist, you can actually start a userland VNC server inside of the container and connect to it.
It's a simple port export at that point.
Yeah. But yeah, for now, just think of it as a way to run server-side apps.
Yeah.
All right. This slide just shows what I just mentioned, actually. Like kind of running Windows Server containers and Hyper-V containers. So you can see here are the standard userland processes running on a Windows system. This shows a single Windows Server container running. You can see this it shares the same Windows kernel with the other userland processes, and you could run several Windows Server containers, right? And then over here is a Hyper-V container. So it gets its own hypervisor with its own minimal Windows kernel, and then the container process runs inside of there. Yeah, and I'll do a demo in a few seconds, but just should you be interested in trying this out, if you have Windows 10 with the anniversary edition update, Microsoft actually shipped the kernel enhancements slated for Windows Server 2016 in Windows 10 also. So you can run Windows Server containers directly on Windows 10, kind of the same way you would on a Linux desktop system. Or you can just get the Windows Server 2016 eval, run it in a VM, and install Darken Engine. You can run it on Azure, AWS, and Google Cloud also has Windows Server 2016 support at this point. Yeah, as I mentioned, it's just a few PowerShell commands to set it up. And you can check out the Docker blog. I have a blog post on how to get started. Oh yeah, and just wanted to mention the question you asked. So, by default, the default Windows, the default Docker engine that gets installed on Windows Server is the Docker CS engine. So it's the commercially supported Docker engine, and it just comes included with Windows Server. And so the way that works is that Microsoft handles first-line support. If you have problems running Docker on Windows, they can then escalate to Docker if they can't figure out what's going on, and we can escalate back to the Windows guys. Yeah. Try to do it demo. I'm not looking. All right. So as I mentioned, there's a couple of different ways that you can run Windows containers. In this case, I'm actually running a Windows Server 2016 system in a VM. But you can see the neat thing here is you've been able to run the Docker client on Windows for a long time. So I have the client up here. It's on Windows. But the new thing is that my server is also running on Windows. And I have all the familiar commands, so I can do Docker images. I have a bunch of images. And I can run a nanoserver container, for example. So this is doing Docker run, and I want to attach the console, and I'm running PowerShell. So on Windows, there's no bash, obviously. So I run PowerShell, and then that nanoserver container should be booting. Like so. And I can do dir. And I have a kind of completely virgin Windows system that I can use here. And just to show you, so this is just doing Docker PS, right? I can do the same thing of listing running containers that I would do on Linux. And if I do, yeah, I don't even know, add content. Ooh. So I just created a file. There's no touch on Windows either. And then I can run another nanoserver container. And I can do dir. And there's no file, right? So the isolation semantics of isolated file systems and an isolated Windows registry are exactly the same as on Linux. You can run two Windows containers side by side. One of them can blow up the file system, and it doesn't affect either the host or any other containers running on that system. So you get the same isolation. And also there's also full process isolation. So whoops. So I can't see processes running in other containers on the host. And that goes for both Windows Server containers and Hyper-V containers. Just to show you a slightly more complicated example. Let's see. I don't know how many here are kind of casual Docker users. Okay, a few. Cool. So you'll be familiar with kind of Docker files. I just wanted to show you what our Windows Docker file looks like. And the way it looks is the same as on Linux. Like you have the familiar Docker instructions. So in this case, I do from Microsoft/.NET. So this is a base image that Microsoft publishes with .NET already installed. And then I can run a set of commands to build my container image. Just in this case, I run PowerShell commands versus bash or shell commands on Linux. And also Docker Compose is the same. So in this case, I have this is just a standard kind of two-tier app with a web front end and a database backend. So I have my DB service, which is based on Microsoft SQL Server, Express. And then I have a web service that I built. with my ASP.NET Core app running on Windows. So with that, I can do Docker Compose up like this. And then Docker Compose will start spinning up the 2 containers required to make this run and connect them together. And once that's started, I should be able to visit my site. 1.5,000. Yeah, so just to show that kind of, for now we have single host networking working with Windows. So there's still a few discrepancies between what you can do on Linux versus what you can do on Windows. Single host networking works, which means that in this case my web container can talk to my database container. We're still working on making kind of multi-host overlay networking work on Windows, and also on supporting kind of heterogeneous environments where you have both Linux and Windows nodes and containers running on both, talking to one another seamlessly. But my ASP.NET app is up here, and I can click around and look at stuff that's fetched from out of the database. So one thing, I don't know, has anybody here ever installed or maintained Microsoft SQL Server? Quite a few. Like, so it's big, right? And it takes a long time to install and get going. So a neat thing that you can do. This I'm just spinning up a SQL Server instance as a daemon. So that was one. I can get another one going. And these are like full, fresh instances of SQL Server running in an isolated context. It takes maybe a second or two to spin up, and I can then go use them, connect to them with a SQL Server Management Studio or whatever. And yeah, it's just pretty neat. If you spent a lot of time installing SQL Server, this is a lot easier. This is what, yeah. All right.
Typically, if a developer was going to be using a Docker container for SQL, would it be like, the developer needs some sort of static data, and he doesn't want to have to mess around. So he can have a database with a bunch of data already in it, and then he can spin up the container and be like, look, I can interact with the data with this application I'm building.
Yeah, that's perfectly feasible. Like, you could take the SQL Server base image and then spin it up, feed a bunch of data into it, and then save that image with the data preloaded.
Mm-hmm.
That works perfectly well. Okay. Or you can do
one-to-one, right?
Yeah, you have a bunch of different options. You can also, if you want to run kind of more persistent manner, right? Like, so in terms of persistence, the semantics is also the same as on Windows. So by default, the data is just going to be in the container image and in the running container, and when it shuts down, that all goes away.
Right.
But you can, same as on Linux, you can mount host folders with your MDF database files into the container, and then any changes made by the container are persisted out onto the host file system, so you can then reuse it, start another container, mounting the same files in.
Your Docker file, your compose file will basically say mount these MDF files or whatever.
Yeah, you have like a little sidecar directory with MDF files, and then you mount
Right.
that into the container. That worked perfectly well.
Okay.
So for the SQL database storage, then, are you saying you could use VHDX files or and mount those, or do it over SMB3 on a share, that kind of thing?
Well,
The persistent layer.
so the simplest thing is just to mount host folders into the container, but then you'd have to make sure that those host folders are durable somehow, right? Like, so if you know the host is going to go down, so that could be like either you could use a storage driver, one of the Docker Volume plugins, or that host folder could be like some sort of storage array that you know is super durable. It's something we're still working on this. Microsoft already has great relationships with a bunch of kind of storage vendors, and we're working with Microsoft and those vendors to also make this work for Docker on Windows. Cool. Yeah, that's all I had for the Windows container demo. As I mentioned, we do a bunch of other stuff with Microsoft, including .NET Core, SQL Server, and Visual Studio tooling, and Azure. And here are a bunch of great links if you want to try out Windows Server containers. And always feel free to tweet at me if you have questions or build something cool. With that, I'm happy to take other questions about Windows Server containers.
You mentioned just briefly heterogeneity and choosing between running a container on Linux or Windows. One of the things that I have heard, and I think I saw when you were showing that you can't see the processes running in your one container or in the other container, one of the things that I have heard people say is there seems to be a lot of processes running in the Windows container before you even do anything.
Yeah.
My question is really just, my question is really just as I am looking at, do I want to build this application and run this container on Linux or Windows? Should that be one of my considerations? And is a Linux container actually more lightweight?
Yeah, I think still Linux containers are more lightweight. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. I'm not actually sure the process problem is that big. It's just kind of an artifact of the way Windows is architected. But yeah, it's not the best, right? And again, I highly recommend John Stark's session from DockerCon, where he talks about how they were looking at the same thing and examining the processes running in a newly set up Windows system, including like a fax service that they then hopefully decided not to include in the base images for Docker. But I mean, I don't know. Like I think if you're starting with a greenfield app and you have, okay, so say you're a .NET developer, you're starting with a greenfield app, and then now there's actually a really compelling way to run .NET on Linux with .NET Core, which is like a fully supported by Microsoft version of the .NET framework that runs on Linux and on OS X for that matter also. So that's a pretty good option. But if you have legacy apps, or if you really like Windows, then now you can have like a way better time developing that Windows app using containers. Like you get all the same benefits that you do on Linux with like eliminating the kind of works on my machine problem. Like if you have a .NET app, you check in a Docker file that builds a Windows container image, and your colleague will check out that source code, and they have a dependable way to build the same image, or maybe they just pull the image from a registry. So you get dependable builds, dependable build ship run pipeline with known good build artifacts that you've tested.
Maybe too early to ask, but are there people running Windows containers in production right now?
Yeah, there are actually. Microsoft profiled a few at Ignite in Atlanta. Yeah, I should have put logos on my slide, but yeah, that's definitely the case.
For what services?
It's they're taking IIS web apps and moving them into containers. Trying to think what else. Yeah, that's really the typical use case. Trying to build a better software delivery pipeline for existing .NET apps that run on IIS by using Docker.